דני קנמן, אני משער שאף אחד לא יודע מי זה, אז אני אגיד לכם כמה דברים שהם פחות או יותר כולם common knowledge, ידועים לכולם, אבל בכל זאת כדאי לחזור עליהם. אז דני נולד בשנת 1934 בתל אביב. מהבית ספר התיכון, הנה משהו שגיליתי באוטוביוגרפיית נובל שלו, היה לו פנקס שבו הוא כתב כל מיני דברים. הכותרת של הפנקס היה, מה שאני כותב על מה שאני חושב. מזכיר לכם משהו לגבי ההרצאה היום? אני לא יודע, אבל אולי. כן, אז אתם רואים, השורש של ההרצאה היום הוא כנראה קצת ותיק. אני מדבר על שנות ה-40. בשנת 48, טיפה לפני שמדינת ישראל נוסדה, הוא עלה לארץ עם משפחתו, אני צודק? אני רואה? 46, סליחה, אוקיי. תואר ראשון בפסיכולוגיה ומתמטיקה באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, דוקטורט בפסיכולוגיה באוניברסיטת ברקלי, אוניברסיטה של קליפורניה בברקלי, אחר כך מינוי כאיש סגל במחלקה לפסיכולוגיה באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, מ-61 עד 78, האוניברסיטה of British Columbia, 78 עד 86, אוניברסיטת קליפורניה בברקלי, מ-86 עד 93, ומשנת 93 בפרינסטון, באוניברסיטת פרינסטון, במחלקה לפסיכולוגיה ו-Public Affairs, אני לא יודע איך לתרגם את זה בדיוק. האמת היא שאני הכנתי את זה באנגלית, אבל טוב, אני פתאום עשיתי סוויץ' של השפה, אבל בסדר. ההרצאה תהיה באנגלית, אני מבין, נכון? אז זהו, אז אנחנו נקפוץ בין השפות. אגב, משנת 2000 הוא עמית של המרכז לחקר הרציונליות באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים. זה היה לפני שהוא קיבל את פרס נובל. כי אחרי שהוא קיבל את פרס נובל, עכשיו הוא חבר בכל מיני מקומות, אבל זה לפני שהוא קיבל את פרס נובל, מיוזמתו רצה להצטרף למרכז לחקר הרציונליות באוניברסיטה העברית. רשימת הפרסים שלו היא באמת ארוכה, ואני לא הולך לחזור על זה, אני רק אומר שהוא קיבל פרס נובל בכלכלה בשנת 2002, ואני אקריא, תמיד עם פרס נובל מגיע איזשהו משפטון קצר שמסכם את הסיבה שנותנים למישהו פרס נובל, for having integrated insights from psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision making under uncertainty. שנת 2003 קיבל, אני חושב מנשיא אובמה, את ה-Presidential Medal of Freedom. יש לו תוארי דוקטורט כבוד, אני ספרתי מעל 20, גם מהארץ, מהאוניברסיטה העברית וגם מאוניברסיטת חיפה. הוא חבר ב-American Academy of Arts and Sciences, ב-American Philosophical Society, ב-British Academy, ב-National Academy of Sciences of the US, ויש עוד רשימה ארוכה, שוב, אני מקצר. לגבי התרומות המדעיות שלו, אז כבר שמענו בדברי פרופסור הראל, שיתוף הפעולה שלו עם עמוס טברסקי, מאוד מפורסמת, השיתוף פעולה מאוד מפורסם, בעיקר בתקופה שהוא היה פרופסור באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, שנות ה-60, שנות ה-70, על קבלת החלטות, על judgment, נו, עכשיו אני צריך, מה זה? שיפוט וקבלת החלטות, בעיקר בתנאי אי ודאות. כמובן זה הוביל לפרס נובל. המאמר שלהם בסייאנס, Judgment under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases, קיבל, יש לו היום בערך 50,000 ציטוטים בגוגל סקולר. התחום שנקרא Behavioral Economics, שמסתכל על האפקטים של גורמים פסיכולוגיים וגורמים חברתיים אחרים על קבלת החלטות, על שיפוטים, על שיפוט, על כלכלה. התחום הזה נוצר בזכות שיתוף הפעולה בין דני ועמוס. זה לא כל מה שדני עשה. ישנו תחום שנקרא hedonic psychology, אני לא יודע איך לתרגם את זה לעברית, יש איזה תרגום מהפסיכולוגים? מה?
פסיכולוגיה הדוניסטית.
יופי של תרגום, פסיכולוגיה הדוניסטית, אוקיי, אז כן, מצוין. הפסיכולוגיה של ה-well-being, עוד פעם, לא יודע איך לתרגם. בשנת 2011 פרסם דני ספר, Thinking Fast and Slow. עכשיו יש לי שני סיפורים על זה. לפני שהוא פרסם את הספר, דני ביקש מכמה אנשים לקרוא את הספר ולשכנע אותו שלא כדאי לו לפרסם את זה. או אולי כן לשכנע אותו שיפרסם את זה. למזלנו, האנשים האלה כן שכנעו אותו לפרסם את זה, והספר באמת הפך להצלחה כבירה. אחד מהאנשים האלה אמר לו, תשמע, ספר לא רע, ה-bad news זה שזה, ככל שמתקדמים זה נעשה יותר ויותר קשה. לקראת הסוף זה באמת קשה. ה-good news, אף אחד לא יגיע לסוף. קורא מספר 2 היה פסיכולוג צעיר שדני ביקש ממנו שיקרא את הספר ויגיד לו האם זה נראה כמו סיפורי מעשיות של איש זקן ושזה יבייש את צעירותו. אוקיי? זה לא, כמו שאתם יודעים. הספר החדש שלו שפרסם בשנת 2021 על נויז, יחד עם אוליביה סיבוני וקאס סנסטיין, אני חושב שאולי אפילו תדבר על זה היום קצת, גם זה עושה רעש. אוקיי, אז ההרצאה היום, Thinking about Thinking, רנה דקארט בטח היה אומר, קוג'יטו דה קוג'יטו ארגו סום סום, זה לא על הבורקסים, כן? דני, בבקשה.
אני החלטתי לדבר אנגלית, מפני שמספיק קשה לדבר באנגלית, ולדבר בעברית על דברים מקצועיים ממש קשה לי. So, it's an honor to be here, and an honor to give a lecture named after Martin Buber. He was a revered and distant figure when I was an undergraduate here in the early 1950s. And I still remember the special, respectful voice with which we would whisper his name. He was known as a moral authority, widely admired but not obeyed. And his moral position about Zionism would be no less relevant and even less obeyed today. My talk today will have an unusual format. For the last several years, my talk today will have an unusual format. For the last several years, I've mostly avoided giving talks, except for a few in particular and narrow topics. I preferred an interview format, in which I left the structure to the interviewer, which made my life much easier. Now, in preparing for this talk, I spent quite a while, actually, trying to present 2 long books in about 45 minutes, and I almost succeeded. But I decided that I liked the interviewing format better, and in the absence of an interviewer, I decided to interview myself. So, which means that I will pose questions and attempt to answer, with little attempt to maintain continuity between the topics between the questions that I'll deal with. And I'll start with a very easy first question. What were the most significant part of my career? And the answer, that one is really quite easy. Many here probably know Amos Tversky and remember him. There are surely quite a few people who knew him. And for those who knew him, the memories of him are fresh and distinctive, even after nearly 27 years since he died, because he was quite an extraordinary character. A distinguished social psychologist once proposed as an intelligence test how much time it took you to realize that Amos was more intelligent than you are. And Amos was not only brilliant, he was consistently funny. And so the years of our close collaboration were the most joyful of my career. And I want to show a picture of what he looked like when we did the work. And you can see, I hope, the character and how much fun it was to do that work with him. We started in 1969 on the questions of whether people are good intuitive statisticians. We started actually a discussion in a seminar on that problem. And from that discussion in the seminar and then a conversation in Café Rimon, for the old people who still remember that place, started a collaboration. And we worked together for more than 12 years, and our method was to observe our own intuitions. And I'll give you several examples of what the intuitions are. But one example is, if I tell you about somebody who I describe him as a meek and tidy soul with a passion for detail, and I ask you whether he's likely to be a librarian or a farmer, you have a very easy choice. And actually much more confident than you should have that he is a librarian rather than farmer. This is in principle a statistical question, but what came to mind is not a statistical answer. And our method was to look for intuitions of that kind, and I'll give you a lot of examples of that. We wrote a paper in 1974. Actually, we spent a year in this building writing a single paper, and a day on which we would do 2 or 3 sentences was a very good day. But actually, every day was a very good day. And in that paper, we described 3 mechanisms and about 3 psychological mechanisms and about 15 biases or systematic errors that are produced by these mechanisms. The mechanisms, by the way, usually work, and mostly people are reasonable, if not fully rational. I'll come back to that issue. But they do make predictable errors. Any mechanism that is not fully logical is going to make predictable errors. And in general, the form of the errors that people make, that we studied, are paying attention to a variable that should be ignored or ignoring a variable to which you should pay attention. And those are the biases that we studied in thinking are really of that type, of attending to irrelevant material and not attending to relevant issues. The paper, as was mentioned, actually had a fair amount of impact. Some of it actually was immediate. Peter Diamond, the Nobel Laureate in economics, had it in his, told me proudly that he had it in his reading list within a couple of years after it was published. And certainly the most important thing that happened as a result of this paper was that it influenced Richard Thaler, who is a recent, 2017 Nobel Laureate and the guru of behavioral economics. And for Richard Thaler, he wrote a book, Misbehaving, an autobiographical book, and he described the experience of seeing that errors are predictable. And he was not prepared for that. So that is, it's not that the rational agent model says that you never make mistakes, but the mistakes are supposed to be random. Predictable errors are a real challenge to the theory. So, the main reason, I think, for the impact across disciplines is not so much the content. The content was pretty good, but it's the reason the content was influential was the medium. And what we did and what we specialized in doing, and we didn't do it deliberately to achieve influence, but just it was so much fun to do it, we asked single questions that made a point. Instead of elaborate tests, we had what we call single question psychology. In fact, all our questions are demonstrations. And demonstrations make a point directly by appealing to your own experience. I'll give you an example, not from our work. This is a familiar illusion. Now, this shows you that you can eliminate the illusion. Now the 2 lines look alike. And the fact that you know that the 2 lines are similarly long has absolutely no effect. When I show you the same picture again, you have the same illusion. And something very much like that is what we call cognitive illusions. And that was the topic on which we worked. So cognitive illusions are they worked on us. We were our primary subjects. And if we had an intuition, a wish to give the wrong answer to a question, we thought that other people would share the same wish, and in general, we were right. Now, the demonstration technique and the single question psychology was effective across disciplines because you can present the problem on the page like an illusion, and you don't have to describe methods, you don't have to describe statistics. This is supposed to work on the reader, to recognize intuitions, and that people, it turned out in several different disciplines, found fairly convincing. So demonstrations of systematic errors are hard to ignore, and that's why these demonstrations, which in a way appear quite childish and very simple, as you will see, were taken as a threat to the rational agent model. So in this respect, as in many others, Amos and I were extraordinarily lucky that we chose a method that magnified the impact of our work. Now, my next interview question is, what are my favorite demonstrations? Some of them demonstrations that Amos and I constructed, and others that were done later, and others that were done by other people. So what I'll do now is show you a number of the questions that we asked, or that have been asked. Each of them, I think, will evoke an incorrect intuition that you will be able to recognize. And that's the idea. That's what I want to do in this talk primarily. Sometimes you will see the problem and you will see that this intuition is wrong, but you will have the intuition anyway. Typically, it's the first thing that comes to mind. And you should be able to recognize it. I'm counting on it, that you will, because there is a lot of data, actually, that support this. And this was the main thing that Amos and I did during working hours, was prepare problems like the one I'll show. Now, what we did was to construct problems where we knew the correct solution, but recognized in ourselves an intuition to answer it differently. And that is going to be common to all the problems that I'm going to show you. The problems have fooled a large number of statistically naive people, but I almost like to say that for every problem that fools a novice, there is a more complicated problem, a more complicated version that will fool an expert. And he was right. It turns out most of these intuitions that I will describe are fairly robust, and you can find them in the work of experts and in the work of people even who know statistics. So, my recollection, by the way, that the only group where we found 100% of people making a mistake, that's very rare because people answer randomly, but 100% mistake, that happened in a group of physicians. That is a high-level group. That's where you can count on people reliably making mistakes. So let me show you the first example. So Julie is graduating at an American university. She's a graduating senior. And I'm telling you just one fact about her, which is that she read fluently when she was 4 years old. That's all I'm telling you. And I'm asking you, what is her GPA? What is her grade point average? And you know the American systems with 4 is an A. And I think I can say safely that all of you have an answer, an intuitive answer that came to your mind. And actually, in this case, we know almost exactly how that answer came to mind. And this is the mechanism. She read fluently at age 4. You know how extreme that is. You get an impression of how extreme it is on a scale of precociousness. What you do and the GPA that you produce is a GPA that is as extreme, as intense as her precociousness in reading. You just match. And for this, there is a lot of evidence that this is how that number comes to your mind. The number for Americans in general is somewhere around 3.7, and which corresponds 3.7, 3.8. It's in that vicinity, and it corresponds quite closely to what people think how precocious reading fluently at age 4 is. So clearly, if you stop to think of it, this intuition is ridiculously wrong. And it's ridiculously wrong because the age at which Julie learned how to read is really not very informative with respect to her grades 20 years later. A lot of things could have happened to Julie that would have made that initial prediction completely false. So the way to do it, the correct way to do it, and we know that as well, is to ask what is the average GPA in an American university, and she probably is above average. Your best guess is that she would be above average, but not much above average, because you have to do that proportionately to the correlation that you expect to have between precocious reading and GPA. There are 3 psychological principles in this simple example. One I call substitution, and this is answering a question that you were not asked. Because you were asked about her GPA, but the question you really answered was how precocious she was in reading. And that is a very common process, this process of answering a different question. The other process that happens to people very readily in this situation is matching, which means that you go across units, the units of the age at which she read, and that goes into units of GPA, and you match the intensity across those scales, and this is something that happens intuitively and automatically, and at such a speed that in the first instant you probably had a response, and that response involved substitution and matching, and another principle, which I later called what you see is all there is, which is basically you were given very little information, and you acted your intuition acted as if that information was sufficient. And any amount of information, provided that it passes a fairly low level of a test of relevance, has that characteristic. So fast thinking, which is the way I called it later, is sort of literal and gullible, and it jumps to conclusions. And that's what this example shows. Now, here's another one, quite a famous example. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much did the ball cost? This is now one of the most famous questions in all of psychology, and the key thing to know is that a number came to your mind when this happens. The number is 10 cents. That's an association that just about everybody, it's the first answer that comes to mind. That is false, clearly, because 10 cents and $1.10 is $1.20, so that can't be right. The correct answer is 5 cents. But 50% of students at Harvard fail this question. And we know something about the students who fail this question. We know they didn't check, because if they had checked, they would have known that this is the wrong answer. So the main thing that we learn here is that you have an intuitive response, and people have too much faith in their intuitive responses. So fast thinking, as I called it later, is something that happens to us. It's like when I say 2 + 2, something happens to you. When I say Adolf Hitler, something happens to you. It's not something you do. It really, you are passive with respect to that experience or that thought. So slow thinking, in contrast, are things we do. They're thoughts and actions that we feel authorship of, which is not the case for fast thinking. And it would be slow thinking to stop yourself, check, and compute the correct answer, which for some people is very easy, and for some people, who the author of this problem is Shane Frederick, my friend and former postdoc. He speaks of 3 kinds of people: the people who actually solve it, And then there are people who are careless, and that's the 50% of Harvard students who fail. They could pass it if they checked. And then there is a third category that he calls hopeless, that even if they did try to compute, they couldn't solve the problem. Now, this particular problem has been studied in hundreds of articles, literally, and it's diagnostic of impulsive thinking, basically. And so there is a study that Shane, Frederick, and Maya Bar-Hillel and I are part of that is going on now, and where we're finding a correlation between this question and questions of expressions of impulsive thinking. For example, people who fail this question are likely to endorse the statement that the 9/11 bombers were cowards. This is, if you stop to think about it, can't be true. They were not really cowards. But the impulsive response is cowards are bad, they were bad, therefore yes. And we find a correlation between impulsive thinking and this particular question. So, let me show you another example. So, the question is, how many words in a body of text end with ing? And there is another version of the question, which is, how many words have n in the sixth position? Now, clearly, there are more words with n in the sixth position than words that end with ing, but you probably have the intuitions that when people are asked one of these questions, the group that is asked about n gives a smaller number, a smaller estimate than the group that is asked about ing. And the reason is examples are easier to generate, and people estimate the number of words by the ease with which they generate them. We call that the availability heuristic. I beg your pardon?
7-letter word?
Yes. It says 7-letter words.
It's eight.
Well, I said 6? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. That's my mistake. The problem is 7-letter words. Awful mistake. Okay. What is striking about that problem, you can present those two together in a test, and quite a few people think there are more words that end with ing than end with n, and those tend to be the same people who fail the bat and ball problem. So it's a test, another test of impulsive thinking. And whoops, I went too far. Okay, here is the next example. And something came to your mind. Now, quite a few people in this audience worked it out very quickly, but I think even the people who worked it out very quickly had an intuition that is similar to the intuition of statistically unsophisticated people. You start figuring out how that happened. You start developing a causal explanation of why intelligent women would marry men who are less intelligent than they are. And there is no shortage of explanations that people can give. But the point that I want to make is that the first impulse is to look for causes. In fact, there is no causality here. It is completely, it's a sufficient explanation to explain it in purely statistical terms. I could give you an equivalent problem, which would be intelligence, the distribution of intelligence is similar for men and for women, and the correlation between the intelligence of husbands and wives is less than unity. This is algebraically equivalent to this statement. But the second statement of the problem is not one that you feel needs to be answered. It's obvious. And it's obvious that it's statistical. This actually turns out to be quite deep. The preference for causal thinking over statistical thinking is a very general phenomenon. Now, and our fast thinking, the intuitive thinking, has a very strong preference for causality and for causal thinking, and in fact a great deal of difficulty with statistical thinking. Statistical thinking is not intuitive. You may have noticed something else, for those of you who introspected on that issue, that when you looked for an explanation, for a causal explanation, you were thinking of a typical intelligent woman. You were thinking in the singular about a typical intelligent woman and why she would marry a man that is less intelligent than she is. This is very common in causal thinking. Now, our most famous example is the following, and it's Linda, it's almost as famous as the bat and ball problem. Linda is 31 years old, single, bright, etc. You can read it. And the question that I asked, the first question that I want to ask about Linda is, who is Linda more like? A bank teller or a feminist bank teller? And the answer is immediately obvious, that she is more like a feminist bank teller. And that doesn't violate logic. It's perfectly sensible. If you have an image of feminist bank tellers, the description of Linda fits it better. But now look at the next question. What is Linda more likely to be? And this is a question about probability. And people give the same answer. The majority of people give the same answer. That is wrong, because clearly, if she is a feminist bank teller, she is a bank teller. So the probability of her being a bank teller can only be higher than the probability of her being a feminist bank teller. This many people miss. Sophisticated statisticians do not miss it, but when you present it as a direct problem, but when you show those two questions one at a time, again, as with the ing and n, people think that the probability is higher, assign a higher probability to the event of Linda being a feminist bank teller. So, what do we learn from this? I think what we learn is something that I mentioned earlier, that a category is represented by a prototypical instance. That is, when you're thinking of bank tellers, you're thinking not of the set of bank tellers, you're thinking of a prototypical bank teller or of a prototypical feminist. And the conjunction effect, that's what we called it, is appropriate for a judgment of similarity between the prototype of the profession and the description of the person. But it's not actually appropriate to the probability question. And here, let me show you an example that might make the point. What is the average line of these lengths? This is something that people see. They see it immediately. There is absolutely no difficulty with that problem. When I present the same line, and I say, what is the sum of the length of the lines? This is a qualitatively different experience. This you have to compute. Now, the first question of what is the average length, I was asking for a prototype. In the second question, I'm asking a question that people here might recognize. The word is an extensional question. It refers to the set of lines and to a characteristic for which you have to enumerate the lines and sum their properties. And it turns out that one of these is intuitive and easy and natural, and that's thinking of the prototype, and one really requires computation, and there is no intuition about it, and this is thinking of an extensional characteristic. So, for logical or statistical thinking, categories should be represented by their extension. They should be represented by the enumeration of the members of a set. This is the familiar logic of Venn diagrams. But that's not the way intuition works. Intuitive thinking deals with individual instances or with prototypical instances. So, of course, this can be corrected to some extent by education. People who know, many people who have had some education about this recognize the logic of this. But if you present the Linda problem in such a way that bank teller and feminist bank teller do not appear next to each other, and you ask about their probabilities, then even graduate students in statistics will fail this problem quite reliably. So, now let me show you another example that is something that we didn't do. This is due to Jonathan Evans, an English psychologist. And the question is about the validity of a logical argument. And I won't go through the details, but the argument is not valid. You can see that it would be possible for all roses not to fade, and that would be consistent with the premises. The large majority of students who get this question say the sentence is true. The argument is valid. And why do they say it? They say it because the consequence is true. And this, I think, is a profoundly important phenomenon. People get it right, get that syllogism right, when it's presented in terms of X and Y's or A and B's. They don't get it right when the conclusion is true. Again, what you have is substitution. I ask a question about the validity of the argument, but you answer a question about the truth of the consequence. And another important aspect of this is that, well, this is an example of coherent thinking. This is an example of, and there are many such examples, where truth and validity go together, and it makes a more coherent story when truth and validity go together than when they're opposed to each other. Now, why do I think this is profoundly important? This is because here, what happens is people reason from conclusions to arguments. They don't reason from arguments to conclusions. They reason backward. If they believe in the conclusion, they believe in the argument. And the reason I think this is so important is that this happens all the time. People, all of us, we have beliefs. And when people ask us to explain our beliefs, we provide them with reasons, which are arguments for what we believe. And most of us honestly think that our beliefs are anchored in the arguments for them. This is completely false. And this is an example of the mechanism that makes it false. Actually, you can defeat the argument and people will not change their mind. And this general phenomenon of people keeping to their beliefs when the arguments are destroyed or defeated, that is something that we see certainly in political life. And we see a great deal of it. So, reasons are not causes. The causes of the beliefs are different. They're mostly social. You tend to believe in things that the people that you like and love and trust believe. But the arguments are something entirely different and separate. So, again, and this is really quite important, the thinking is backward. And there is a lot of that, where actually thinking doesn't go in its normal, from premises to conclusions, but it goes backward. And I'll give you some additional examples. Now, people are very rigid in their beliefs. but they are very sensitive to the context in which items appear. So you can read this sentence, and it makes perfect sense if you know that this is the bank of a river. And actually, for most people, this could go quite smoothly. If we'd been talking about fishing earlier, you'd have no problem whatsoever in interpreting bank in that way, the bank of a river. But if you've been talking about money, then you'd be thinking of a financial institution with exactly the same word. So, now, I'll give you two further examples, which are not demonstrations. Both are true stories that happened to me. And I think they make a point that you will recognize. And the first one is that my late wife and I were on vacation on an island in the coral reefs in Australia. And on that island, there are exactly 40 bungalows. And each one has a private beach. And the evening, when we went to dinner, we meet a colleague, a psychologist from Stanford. And we're very surprised. And we comment with coincidence and so on. About 2 weeks later, we're in London, in the theater. The theater is dark. Somebody comes and sits next to me. Then the light comes on, and it's the same guy, John Krosnick. And the point that I want to make, it's not that I was not surprised to see John Krosnick. I was less surprised to see John Krosnick than I would have been to see anybody else that I know. Because John Krosnick, he is the guy whom I meet everywhere. That's the characteristic of that guy. And it takes absolutely no time, no difficulty to update your model and to change your model of John Krosnick. So an event that would be surprising becomes less surprising because it's a characteristic of that individual. And the next example also relates to my late wife. We were at dinner with a couple of people, and then we went to bed, and we were talking about the evening, and she commented about the men in the couple, and she said, he's sexy. Okay. And then she said something quite extraordinary. She said, he doesn't undress the maid himself. And I said, what are you saying? He doesn't undress the maid himself. That makes absolutely no sense. Now, what she had said was he doesn't underestimate himself. But notice what happens and the speed at which it happens. And this is not prediction. It's not that the word sexy makes you predict, that particular interpretation of he doesn't undress the maid himself. There is an ambiguous stimulus which is in the process of being interpreted. And in the process of being interpreted, it makes contact with an event that just happened. And the event that just happened favors a particular interpretation. This is backward thinking. And I think there is something happening in general in psychology, apparently in psychology and in neuroscience, that a lot of thinking had that characteristic. That it's not that we predict, we explain. That is, most of the events happen when there is a stimulus that is ambiguous, we find an explanation for it. It is not that we keep predicting every possible thing, and some of the things that we predict turn out to be true. So this, I think, is a fairly important demonstration. Now, my next question to myself is, did we actually show that people are irrational? And our answer was definitely not. Because rationality, as we understand it, is a technical term in decision theory. And it's a technical term that requires consistency of beliefs, so that and preferences, so that your preferences and your beliefs, when you elicit them one at a time, the whole pattern is consistent. This is much more demanding than being able to reason correctly from premises to a conclusion. This is consistency in the system of beliefs and preferences. Psychologically, it's a complete non-starter. I mean, we are sensitive to context, as we saw earlier, the context of fishing or in the context of money, the same stimulus is going to mean different things. So rationality in the technical term is psychologically impossible. But actually, this is not the normal usage, I think, of the word rationality. People really mean something when they use the word. They mean something like reasonableness, and we would not have said that people are not reasonable. And we certainly would not say that people are irrational. In fact, that's a word I thoroughly dislike, and I would deny any association between our work and a demonstration of irrationality. So we only rejected rationality in the technical, in that extreme technical version. What we showed is something else. We showed that intuitive thinking very frequently dominates our beliefs and our thoughts. We may think that we have reasoned our way to beliefs and thoughts, but in fact their origin is in the intuitive system. That is true. And the intuitive system has some peculiar characteristics that lead to highly predictable errors, as I hope you have experienced. So, the last question that I think I will have a couple of minutes for is, can we trust intuitions and can we trust experts? And there is a heated debate on that question. There is a whole group of psychologists, applied psychologists, who call themselves natural decision-making, students of natural decision-making, and they believe in expert intuition. And they have many wonderful examples of the marvels of expert intuition. So, you have the example I like best is the captain of a firefighting unit, and they're in the kitchen of the building, and suddenly he says, let's get the hell out of here. And they get out of there, and the house explodes, and it turns out that the fire was directly under them. He didn't know what the cue was, but the cue apparently was that his ears were abnormally hot. He didn't know that consciously, but he had that expert intuition. It's quite common among physicians who can recognize a particular diagnosis at a glance. And furthermore, all of us are experts in different fields. For example, all of us know the mood of our spouse from one word on the telephone. And so that's true expertise. This is skilled intuition. And at the same time, clearly, and I've given you some examples, intuition very frequently goes awry. So I engaged in what I call an adversarial collaboration with the guru of natural decision-making. And the question we put to ourselves is, what are the boundaries? I mean, clearly intuition is marvelous, and clearly it is flawed. So where it is marvelous, where is it marvelous, and where is it flawed? It took us 6 years, actually, to reach an answer, which is ridiculously simple. It turns out that there are 3 conditions that are required for expert intuition, the skilled intuition, to develop. And the first one is that there should be regularity in the world. There should be some laws that can be picked up. So there is a law, there is a regularity between your spouse's voice on the telephone and her mood or his mood. So there is a regularity. That's the first condition. The second condition is a lot of practice. And that's common to all the examples in which we marvel at intuitions, like the chess players who recognize, white mates in 3 and they walk past a complex situation. That develops with intense practice. And the third condition is rapid feedback. That is, you have to know very quickly whether your intuition is correct or not. If those 3 conditions are satisfied, expert intuition will develop. But if they're not satisfied, if only a single one of them is not satisfied, expert intuition will not develop. And yet, subjectively, people have a real sense that they're expert at many things. And we feel expertise when we follow our intuitions of the kind that I was describing earlier. That is how people follow their intuitions without checking. This is extremely common. Now, an interesting fact that we discussed in the more recent book that we wrote about noise, an interesting fact is that there are some professions where there is no feedback at all. So if you take underwriters in insurance companies, so they set a premium, and they will never know typically whether that premium was high or low. I mean, it takes years to find out. They will not find out. And there is just no feedback. And yet, there is expertise. We call those people who are experts, who appear to be like experts, and they feel like experts. We call them respect experts, as distinguished, I would say, from real experts. Respect experts, in many ways that they look and act like regular experts, except they do not necessarily know what they're doing because they don't have feedback. And without feedback, you cannot learn what you're doing. Now, we have an idea of how subjective confidence builds up and how somebody could become a respect expert, certainly in their own eyes. And the mechanism is, I think, quite interesting. It is, for a professional, when you begin to agree with yourself, that's when you feel you're developing expertise. That is, when you are faced with a problem and it reminds you of a similar problem and you want to say the same thing that you wanted to say earlier, that feels right. And it feels like you're onto something. And the book Noise, that I won't discuss, is a book about how people who think they're experts can have completely different views of the same problem because there is no feedback to control it. And so agreement with yourself is an important condition for subjective expertise. And what causes people to be experts is they have to be articulate, they have to be intelligent, they have to know many facts. There were expert astrologers, undoubtedly. Some astrologers were more expert than others. And this happens everywhere, all the time. And what is quite surprising, actually, is how little distinction we draw between real experts and respect experts. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Danny. I think we have time for, I guess my intuition says that we have time for maybe a couple of questions. Now, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and then you're going to get something like this. Look at the people that raise their hand. תסתכל על מי שמרים את הידיים.
אפשר לשאול בעברית אגב.
הבנו את הבעיה, מה הפתרון?
אני רציתי לדבר על הפתרון, אבל לא הגעתי אליו. ואני אגיד משהו על הפתרון שאנחנו עוסקים בו בספר על רעש, שזה הספר האחרון שכתבתי, האחרון אגב בכל המובנים. ובספר הזה אנחנו מדברים על decision hygiene, על היגיינה של קבלת החלטות. והכוונה ב-decision hygiene זה להבדיל בין טיפול ברעש לבין טיפול ב-biases, בהטיות. הטיות זה כמו מחלות, הן ספציפיות, ואז יש לזה, יש חיסונים ויש תרופות שהן ספציפיות למחלות. היגיינה זה משהו אחר לגמרי. היגיינה זה כשאתה לא יודע מהו החיידק שנגדו אתה נאבק. יתרה מזאת אתה לעולם לא תדע, ובוודאי שלא תדע אם הצלחת. ומסתבר שישנם כללים בהיגיינה של החלטות שהם כן עוזרים לקרב פתרונות. ופה אני אספר פשוט סיפור אישי. אני ב-1956 הייתי קצין ביחידה הפסיכולוגית ופיתחתי רעיון לחיילים קרביים. הרעיון עדיין באיזושהי ורסיה קיים עד היום, צה"ל עדיין משתמש בו. והרעיון של הרעיון היה לפרק את הבעיה. לפרק את הבעיה למרכיבים, מהם המרכיבים של חייל טוב, ולעבוד על כל מרכיב באורח בלתי תלוי במרכיבים אחרים. ולתת ציון לכל מרכיב ולדחות את האינטואיציה הכוללת לגבי האדם עד שיהיו כל הפרטים. זה מה שעשיתי ב-56. בספר ב-81 בעצם חזרנו על אותו פתרון. זה לא פתרון, מפני שזה לא פותר את הבעיה, זה רק משפר קצת. והשיפור בא אם אתה חושב, נניח בקבלת החלטות, על אופציות בתור מועמדים. ואז בעצם אותו פתרון שאפשר היה ליישם לרעיון, אפשר ליישם גם בקבלת החלטות. זאת אומרת, יש המלצות איך לשפר את התהליך של שיפוט של החלטה, בעיקר בארגונים. אני לא חושב שיש פתרון לאדם בודד לשפר את החשיבה שלו, יש מקום לשיפור בחשיבה של ארגונים. זו הייתה תשובה ארוכה מאוד. אז יש אולי זמן לעוד שאלה, אבל ודאי לא יותר.
אתה יודע לאפיין את השאלות הקוגניטיביות, את השאלות שיוצרות אילוציה קוגניטיבית, שגורמות לאינטואיציה לטעות? יש לזה אפיון?
אין אפיון יחיד. הדבר האופייני, וזו ביקורת שיש לכלכלנים על פסיכולוגיה, לכלכלנים יש תיאוריה, לפסיכולוגיה יש רשימות, פשוט ליסטס. אין לנו אפיון כללי למה שגורם. אני ניסיתי לתת לכם תחושה לגבי התכונות העיקריות של חשיבה אינטואיטיבית, ומן התכונות האלה נובעות טעויות, שאנחנו נראה עולם פשוט מדי, אנחנו נראה את העולם כיותר פשוט מן המציאות, ושיותר קוהרנטי מן המציאות, ושנחשוב באופן סיבתי במקום שאין סיבתיות, חשיבה סטטיסטית היא זרה לנו גם במקום שהיא חשובה, אבל זו רשימה של דברים, זה לא תיאוריה אחת, לא יכול לאפיין בקיצור, מצטער.
טוב, שאלה אחרונה.
יש לך איזשהו מושג מבחינה היסטורית, מתי התרבות שלנו שכנעה את עצמה שהאנשים הם רציונליים? מאיפה האילוזיה הזאת הגיעה?
זה מעניין. זה ברור שזה לא תמיד, זה ברור שהרעיון, אריסטו חשב כך, כן, אבל זה לא, היו גם רבים שחשבו אחרת. לא, אין לי תשובה טובה.
טוב, תודה רבה. מגיע לך מדליה. אז רק רגע, אני מזמין את נשיא האקדמיה. Professor Daniel Kahneman, Martin Buber Memorial Lecture, Jerusalem, 2022.